A few years ago, I heard a story of a little country church in Texas that was growing. It was actually a little ways outside of a tiny town in the middle of nowhere called Dublin. I knew of Dublin only because of the famous Dublin Dr. Pepper that is made there. Besides the Dr. Pepper, there really wasn't anything noteworthy about this small town. Yet there was a story of this church nearby. The story made me think there was something different about this church. I heard they were doing some really progressive things in a place where riding a horse is still a viable means of transportation. So I decided to visit this church in an attempt to learn their story and better understand who they are and what they're doing. So I packed my bags and I headed out.
This church, Cottonwood, sits on a highway of 21 miles from Dublin city limits to High Coast city limits, and I joke often that it boasts of about 2 places per mile. So there's no possible, in my mind, no possible way of church growth taking place this far from any major city. We're 90 miles or 80 miles southwest of Fort Worth and 80 miles northwest of Waco.
Mike Fritcher has been pastor of Cottonwood for over 30 years. Over his time, the church has grown from only a couple of families to now seeing over 1,000 people each week. This is quite peculiar when the closest town has only a population of 3,000. This church has experienced remarkable changes with little conflict as they have moved to a contemporary worship style and to an elder leadership model. The congregation is made up of multiple races, ages, languages, and nationalities. They are goat and dairy farmers, students, ranchers, teachers, business people, and the occasional vagabond like myself. Their weekly participants may drive over 90 miles each Sunday, but their influence stretches around the world. It was here in the middle of nowhere that I stumbled across a church that had a story that I needed to hear. It was here that I discovered a people called Cottonwood.
I have never been a part of any other church. I've been here all my life, and I don't know the exact number of years, but approximately 55 years I have been worship leader. Back when I was 17, 18 years old, we were the song leader, and then it got to be called the worship leader. But this church, it was a school, and later on became a Baptist church, and it was organized in 1908, February of 1908. My great-grandparents and my grandparents were charter members of this church. There was a time when there were so few people coming here that the adults just became very discouraged, what few there were, probably 4, 5 maybe. Just became discouraged, and they stopped coming. But there was, I believe there was 5, possibly 6 young people in the community that had grown up here at the church and just determined that we would continue coming on Sunday mornings. And I really don't remember how many weeks that went on, but I don't ever remember that we missed a Sunday. And of course the time came when, of course, some of those adults were my parents. And, but in time, they came back as well as the others, and we still were very few in number, but we had little spurts of growth. As I grew older, married, had my children, have 2 children, they were actually, about that time, they were the only children, young people in this church. And we would have families who would come, and we would be so excited because they'd have children, young children. But most of them would say, you know, we feel like we need to have our children somewhere where there's more for the youth, and they would go. And, you know, that would be heartbreaking, but we continued to come on through the years.
18 months into seminary, I got a call from Cottonwood Baptist Church in Dublin, Texas, or really outside of Dublin, Texas, to come and fill the pulpit. So we did. We came out and preached the morning service and the evening service. There were about 20 people meeting, probably about 15 in Sunday school, probably servicing about 30 people. Pretty much a group of people, all over 50, except for a couple of college students. Just a real typical, what I'd say, typical Southern Baptist church, rural church, North Texas church. You know, just came to supply, but that evening they asked if I'd consider to be their pastor. So, and received that call and thought, well, came back the next week actually and said, yeah, we can be your pastor, but only for 18 months. Because we're going to finish seminary in 18 months, and we're going to head back to the city, and I'm going to plant churches. And that's where I was heading, to suburban ministry, in my mind, in my heart. And so their answer to that was, well, you know what, that's about how long our pastors stay anyway, so we want you to be our pastor, okay? So we came and settled in. I had gone, I jokingly and affectionately say I went from youth ministry to geriatrics for Jesus. So, but again, that was temporary in my mind, and so we just kind of rocked along and, you know, began to do funerals and, you know, began to, you know, just occasionally baptize a person or two, and but no real significant growth. Matter of fact, no growth at all. And but seminary came 18 months later, and we graduated, and just for some reason decided to stick around for a little bit. Just felt that impression. I mean, when you ride up on this place, I mean, even today, when it's empty, there's really no potential to the outward look of the place. I mean, we're just a couple of outbuildings, and you know, God just planted us here. But only with this thought, we're going to go ahead, cut out. Now I had struggled in my life with a fear of dying young, and from the time I was 10 years old, I was 27, and this thing got so controlling of me that I needed help. And in the midst of finding this help, God did this deep work in my life in February of 1987. And not only did God set me free from this fear, but I died that day to every dream, and every vision, and every nice thing anybody ever told me. Because I felt God saying, I want you here the rest of your life. And I'll tell you, there was something hard about that, but there was something so sweet about that. I said yes to God, and I died to those dreams, and I died to those visions, and I had this weight off of me for the first time of no expectation, because what could God do in a place like this?
I do remember after Mike had been here for a while, I was the Sunday school secretary, and I kept all of the records. I counted everybody who was here, class by class, and you know, when we all came, we had 13, 14, maybe 15 in Sunday school, and sometimes we'd make it up to 25 or 30 in church. And I remember Mike coming into that little office where I kept those reports and asking me one Sunday, what do you think could happen as far as a goal? What do you think could happen? I said, oh, Mike, I don't know, as far as growth in the church. I said, I don't know, Mike, because, you know, I had really gone through some, as I mentioned earlier, some growth in the church, but then they seemed to fall away, and it wasn't because of any hard feelings or because they didn't like us. It was just because we just didn't have what they felt like they needed for their young people. Most of it was their young people. Most of them was because of their children. But he said, well, you think you think 50? And I said, I don't know, Mike. I just don't know about 50. And so it pretty soon after that, it just began to grow and
when I decided we were supposed to stay here the rest of our lives and saw no potential for growth, I mean, I died to growth, and I died to worship forms, and I died to all those things. And I wanted to be very sensitive to these people. But I think for us, it was, a death to self, and a death to pride, and a death to the worship of ministry. I think that's the thing that's the idol. It's the golden cow. It's the golden calf. It's the thing that says, I bow down to the success of ministry, and this is what success has got to look like. And I didn't have this in mind. I didn't have anything that you see going on. There wasn't a day that God said, I want you to start doing this, and people are going to come. And I want you to start this ministry, and people are going to start to come. I want to tell you, what's the hardest thing for me today is when people say, what's your vision and what's next? And I want to say, I don't want to even dare to dream that, because I might just get in the way of it. What you see is not because some guy from New Orleans came along and decided to make a plan, and the plan was this. I mean, I'm telling you, I was dead to this. Dead to it. And I think the thing that I struggle with most as your pastor is trying to see this thing raise up back in me. Because I want to tell you, I had dreams of this. Just it wasn't in the middle of nowhere, but it was this. And it's the whole thought of dying to self and becoming conformed to the image of Jesus is not just an individual notion, it's a corporate notion. And am I going to die to agenda, vision, preconceived ideas of what I think ought to be happening here? And I think that's it. And where there's a death of a vision, I think that so often God raises something up so much greater than you ever dreamed of.
I have to admit, all this talk of death really didn't make sense to me. I was interested in how to reproduce something like Cottonwood. Telling people to die just doesn't seem like an appealing approach. I'm a church practitioner, and so I wanted something tangible that I could implement somewhere else. I wanted to know how another church could grow and do the things Cottonwood is doing. What programs or growth plan did they use? What type of vision statement did I need to write down? So I decided to clear it up by talking to some others at Cottonwood.
Coming from corporate America as a manager in a facility, when I think of vision, I think of a specific statement for a specific goal, and with attainable, reachable performances in certain time frames, and that's not been what it's like at Cottonwood. In fact, coming here on staff, I learned that that's not at all the vision or the direction that the church would have, a specific thing to pursue and chase after. It was pretty frustrating to start with because there's no real measurement in what we do at Cottonwood except in the love and the relationship between people. Not having a specific vision statement has made us free. It's allowed us to do what God purposes in the hearts of the individual. And as we walk in relationship with them and we see that and we affirm that call, it becomes real easy to say yes to whatever God has for us. At the same time, there's no easy way to package that up and measure it and tell you this is the success. Several years ago, I had a pastor come in and say, so how did you get to a contemporary worship service? And how is it you decided you'd start doing prison ministry and work with the Navajo? And I just looked at him and I said, what you see happening here is a result of what God's done in the hearts of the individual people. And that's why when you walk into Cottonwood and ask what we do, we're simply going to tell you we love God and we love others. And it could look like a million different things at any time.
There was nothing missional about me, except for taking an offering and sending it to the denomination, Foreign Mission Board or International Mission Board, and we were happy to do missions that way. You know, I mean, I had enough problems, you know, dealing with folks with stuff and things in their lives, and you know, with a church that happened to be growing in the middle of nowhere, but with no thought of being missional in any form or fashion.
There's about 300 of us coming. About 300 of us. And when he came, he stood up here and he said, "This is not about a mission. It's about the glory of God." We've been talking about the glory of God since 1987. Been talking about being conformed to this image.
That night, we spent about an hour in discussion, and then about another 45 minutes in prayer, and ended up being at the church facility that night for about 4 hours, maybe even more. And it was the resounding yes, that God has called us, that we can't shrink back to this, that it is about His glory and not about us. And it's not really even about the Great Commission. It's about God being glorified and honored, not only in our lives but at home. And not only in our lives at home, but even to the ends of the earth.
I learned a large part of Cottonwood's identity was found in their love of others. Surprisingly, it didn't matter if a person ever would come to their church. They just wanted to love people. This played a large role in how they did missions. They didn't talk about missions, but rather talked about living missionally. I quickly learned that living missionally and doing missions were two very different things.
We've tended to think about missions as being a vocation. And the new terminology of being missional is an adjective that describes, rather than a vocation or like a noun, like missionary, or to do missions in terms of a verb. And it becomes then a descriptor of the way that we live and the choices that we're making and the reason that we do certain things. So to be missional in that respect means that we have to look at culture and faith and determine how then we're going to live in a faithful way within a culture and how faith is going to be acted out. And so it's not about a vocation, it's not about going overseas, it's about being faithful within the context that we find ourselves in.
We try not to make too much of a distinction between the people that are actually going and those who stay here, because we feel like if one of us goes, we all go. So we're trying to foster that. We had some people raised up in our body that wanted to go to restricted access country and serve this people that we had embraced and committed ourselves to. And there was a Sunday where we prayed over them before they left, but we just kind of entrusted them to a sending agency. And the sending agency did it all. And when it was all said and done, we felt robbed, you know, that we didn't get to be more a part of what they were doing and where they were going in the struggles. And a lot of that was just our fault, that we just kind of had defaulted to a traditional paradigm of you give your money to the organization and you give your people to the organization and let them do the rest. And at some point we came to the realization that that's no fair. You know, we as the church want to be more greatly involved. So I think more than anything it's probably a shift in perspective. The church has become so accustomed to just sending their money that they've never even thought about the possibility of anything else. I would encourage churches to start thinking about other possibilities beyond just sending your money, because there's a whole host of things that God might be inviting them to, that He could use them. So mainly just start thinking differently. As missions isn't just a program or something that a fringe, weird few of the church does every once in a while, you know, and we give them a little money to go do the weird thing that they do, and they come back and we tolerate them taking 5 minutes of the Sunday morning to tell us what they did.
Cottonwood has begun a process of taking on the responsibility of raising up, training, sending, and financially supporting people from their body. They have chosen not to build buildings and have given above and beyond regular giving in order to support people from their body that have been called.
We've made some mistakes, and it's not always easy. It's costly in terms of money and tough lessons. But we tend to say around here that God calls us not to that which is easy, but to that which is worthy. And certainly loving neighbors cross-culturally is a worthy thing.
I think keeping the main thing, which is loving God and loving neighbor, which is the Great Commandment, will always propel you to the Great Commission. It will always propel you to ministry. It will always propel you to the good works that God calls letting your light shine, so that they see good works and glorify the Father who's in heaven.
Because just going overseas doesn't distinguish them, and because people are going. But if we go and we don't have character, if we go and we're not able to speak about the power of God to change people's lives, then we're just going. We really have nothing to say.
I mean, I shared that little story in staff about the opportunity I had to share with those guys at a bike shop last week, and they were intrigued about Cottonwood and were asking me what makes it different. And I conveyed that story that Jesus told. You know, there was a guy and two other guys owed him money. One owed him $500 and the other guy owed him $50, and he canceled both their debts. And I asked these guys at the bike shop, well, what Jesus asked, who do you think appreciated and loved the guy more? And the one guy answered and said, well, the guy that owed him $500. And I said, at Cottonwood, there are a lot of $500 sinners. And I really feel like there's a brokenness of the people here, and because they've been forgiven much, they tend to love much. And so getting them to love a people whose names they can't even pronounce or language they don't even speak is not that big of a leap for them, because I think they're loving God out of a response to what He's done for them. So when we talk about nations and we talk about going to these places, or we talk about going to the Muslim world, yeah, it's a stretch, but it doesn't take them that long to get to a place where they want to go and they want to serve and they want to love these people. We talk a lot about loving well and loving our neighbor, and we don't distinguish who our neighbor is. We say that our neighbor might entail crossing the street, it might mean crossing a border, it might mean crossing an ocean. So we try to talk generally about loving well our neighbor, whoever that happens to be.
You know, I remember Mike saying shortly after he came here, he said, I have been praying earnestly that God would send to us hurting people. And he said, I encourage all of you to pray with me that He will do that. But I want you to know who that includes. You know, that includes everybody, no matter, you know, if they've served time in prison, if they're drunkards, if they're drug addicts, if they're homosexuals, whoever it is. Those people are hurting, and I pray that God will send them to us.
Well, Cottonwood really does run counter to all the formulas in terms of church growth, in terms of maybe healthy church, or some of the ideas about niche markets and all the things that we've talked about in terms of healthy growing churches. I think what makes it different is that it's a group of broken people, and through their brokenness, God has developed character, and they are making lifestyle choices that distinguishes them within the community and wherever they go. It's not unique in that it's a missional church, I mean going and doing missions. It's not unique in that it has a certain kind of worship. I think the uniqueness is to be found in its people. That they've come to the end of themselves. They were so low as a group of people, broken as a group of people, individually and then corporately, that they have God's been able to remake them.
Because, you know, you can have a mission activity like the Pharisees had. They were great missionaries. They'd go over land and sea to find one convert, the scripture says, and yet they disciple them and they became twice the devil as them. And you can have great worship, and you can do some things in the flesh, like we all do. But the bottom line is, if I don't have love, it profits me nothing. So
the reality is, if you're loving God and loving others, it's all over you. It's a natural flow. That doesn't mean there might be more and more people coming, but it means more and more people are being touched. It becomes an absolutely selfless life, which none of us do right. None of us do perfectly. But the most profound things I've read, and I've read all the books and all the things that cause church growth and all, there's wonderful materials out there. But the most profound things I've ever heard is, greater love has no man than one who lays his life down for another. And for Christ to go on and speak of loving God with everything we've got and loving the other people as we love ourselves, it changes your focus to the person themselves, not the function, not the event, not the ministry being performed, not even their need, but on the person themselves. Ministry happens as an outflow of passion and love.
we have a gal in our church that was checking out of a Mexican food restaurant, and the lady that was checking her out had noticed her cross, and she said, "What? That's a beautiful cross." And they began to talk about the things of God, and the Hispanic lady, the Mexican lady, asked her, said, "Well, where do you go to church?" And she said, "Well, we go to Cottonwood." And this woman paused a minute and said, "That's the church that loves us." You know, here's a lady that never has stepped foot in church at Cottonwood, but has somehow come to know that our church loves the Mexican community. And to me, I think more than anything is what I desire to see us defined as. You know, we don't want to be identified as a missional church or a contemporary church or a regional church or an elder-led church or a staff-led church. We want to be described as a church that loves well. If I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, but have love, I'm a noisy gong, clanging cymbal. If I have all faith so as to remove mountains, gosh, know all the mysteries, but don't have love, profits me nothing. If I give my possessions to feed the poor, and if I give my body to be burned and have not love, I'm nothing. Nothing. And what's interesting, abide faith, hope, and love, but the greatest of these is love. And one day, there'll be no more need of faith and hope, because we'll be there. And where will we be? We'll be loving God and loving one another forever. I'm going to get started now.
We want to have the success of Cottonwood without the death of Cottonwood. We want to instantly get to where we are today with this kind of activity. And I doubt very few people would want to go back to where Mike was and to go through what he went through, and then to live in that kind of space of time with no hope, but only hoping in God. And that's a hard thing. So really the message of Cottonwood is really not a pleasant message, it's a violent message. And I think we can applaud what's happened, we can say praise God, but it may be that we've all got our own Cottonwood paths, and we need to find that. And so it's not to be here, and it may not be on this timetable, but there is a death that all of us have to experience, and that, to me, that's the message of Cottonwood.